Well, since I listed my favourite movies, I'm sure you're wondering what's at the other end of the spectrum. It's time to count down the absolute worst movies I've ever seen. Now keep in mind, this is a personal list, so you're not going to see The Room on here, or Plan 9 from Outer Space, or Troll 2, or Manos the Hands of Fate, or any of the official worst movies ever made. Maybe they would be in the running if I'd actually seen them, but it seems many of them are so bad they're hilarious. No, these are the ones where I cringe just thinking about them. They struck such a raw nerve that the sting will never go away. Keep in mind also that this is going purely by what I've seen to date. There are a fair few movies I haven't seen that look like they'd be deserving of a spot on this list, like Baby Geniuses, Catwoman, and the entire oeuvre of Seltzerberg. And since I came up with 5 close runners-up that I felt should be highlighted in the list itself instead of the quick honourable mentions I usually do, this will be my first top 15 list instead of the usual 10. I could have extended it to a top 20, but think of it as half the length of my favourite movies list. Oh well, let's get this over with. These are the top 15 movies I hate the most. Number 15, Journey Back to Oz, not to be confused with Return to Oz from 1985. An animated sequel to the classic Wizard of Oz, with Liza Minnelli taking over the role of Dorothy from her mother Judy Garland. Sounds ideal? It's not. This is a movie that's very obviously intended only for kids. Very young kids, toddlers. The dialogue is at an infantile level, which even for me watching it as a kid was insufferable to listen to. It's a shame because the story itself is actually pretty well set up and put together, but the dialogue is so bad, so obviously marketing only to its intended audience, that it really does make for an irritating experience. Number 14, Jaws the Revenge. This is about as low as a sequel can get. Everything about it, right down to the premise, is utterly moronic. One moment that really sums it up is when the shark is giving chase by wriggling through a passageway in a shipwreck. It's just too stupid even to laugh at. Really, the extent of imagination in this movie is having it take place at Christmas instead of in the summer. The 4th installment in the film series very rarely works anyway, but this has to be one of the worst offenders. It's a movie that makes you feel dumber for sitting through it. Number 13, Boa vs. Python. If you've seen my favourite movies list, this is kind of the reverse of Sunshine, in that I loved this movie when I first saw it in my mid-teens, simply because it met my shallow expectations of animals and scientific talk. But the more I watched it, the more I realised how terribly made it is. The acting is weak, the CGI is cartoonish, and worst of all is the aimless editing. I can't even laugh at its ineptitude though, it's just lame. So I'm putting it on the list basically to say to my younger self, what the hell were you thinking? Number 12, the Garbage Pail Kids movie. I only became aware of this movie because of the Nostalgia Critics review. I don't venomously hate it as much as Doug does, but it's still one of the most unpleasant movies I've ever seen that's supposedly intended for kids. Its intended message about true ugliness backfires because even the heroes are constantly trying to be cruel in some way, and the story is almost non-existent, often focusing on the kids just doing nothing. But worst of all is the romance between the prepubescent boy and the sub-adult girl, which is wrong on so many levels. It makes for a very miserable experience all around. Number 11, Sucker Punch. Just, and I mean just, escaping the top 10 is this loathsome action fantasy co-written and directed by Zack Snyder. This is a movie where the action scenes have no tension whatsoever because none of them are real. And I don't just mean because they're oversaturated with CGI, they're all in the main character's head, so they don't even have any real stakes. But this movie leaves an especially foul taste in the mouth because it's so shockingly mean-spirited, especially the downright cruel opening and ending. It's just a thoroughly unpleasant movie, and it really left a scar in my soul. Number 10, The Cavern, aka Within. This was the directorial debut of Olatunde Sanmi? I don't care if I'm pronouncing it wrong. And it won't be his last appearance on this list. Much like Boa vs. Python, this is a movie so disastrously inept that it's not even funny. I only know about this movie because FilmBrain reviewed it, and pretty much everything he said about it is true. The performances are all god-awful, and the writing is outrageously stupid, leading up to an absolutely deplorable ending. But worst of all, due to how the exposure or focus or whatever was handled, there's so much color bleeding that the picture is simply ugly to look at. Number 9. BloodRayne. Director Uwe Boll is basically the modern Ed Wood. He's especially infamous for adapting popular video games into abysmal movies. Most people might point to Alone in the Dark as the definitive example of his ineptitude, but I knew nothing about BloodRayne going in, so I was completely unprepared. Not only is the story appallingly nonsensical and poorly written, but every single performance is so awful that it's just plain embarrassing, especially since the cast is mostly well-established, decent actors. But by far the biggest award for butchering a performance goes to Sir Ben Kingsley. Not a single syllable he utters sounds inflected right. Number 8. Bad Boys. I've seldom been more flat-out annoyed by a movie. During the first half, I was tearing at my hair every 5 minutes. I'm dead serious. And that's before we even get to Marcus's lie that dominates the storyline, the photograph scene being perhaps the worst of all the resulting unbearably forced scenarios. The second half goes from excruciating to straight up boring. But one thing consistently drove me nuts. Half the dialogue is yelling, usually for no reason at all. Michael Bay is by far my most hated director. He's the bane of my existence, and talk about being doomed from the very start. Number 7. BloodRayne II: Deliverance. As much as I hated the first BloodRayne, it is Jesus in comparison to this movie. This sequel, also directed by Boll, is so awful it gives me a headache. The camera work is distractingly shoddy, with the camera always swaying around like the cameraman's drunk. The story bears no connection whatsoever to the first movie, and yet acts like we're supposed to know who characters are. Some scenes drag on for so long that the movie grinds to a complete halt. And worse than all of that, it's boring. It's sinfully boring. It's only 100 minutes, but it feels like 5 hours. Number 6. Postal. Okay, I swear this is the last Uwe Boll movie. Of the few movies of his that I've seen, I view this as easily the worst because it's supposed to be a comedy. Whereas his other movies can be enjoyed because they're unintentionally funny, this one is just uncomfortable because there's nothing worse than when a joke falls flat and you're left sitting in awkward silence. Unless you find humor in children getting gunned down, a baby in a pram getting smushed by a truck, or a stationary overweight woman being fucked repeatedly, you'll probably find it just as gallingly distasteful as I did. Number 5. The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2. I haven't seen many of the direct-to-video Disney sequels, but it looks like most of them are definitely worth avoiding. I actually didn't voluntarily watch this one. I happened to be in the room when someone else put it on, and it was one of the most unwelcome experiences of my life. It's just like Journey Back to Oz. It's playing to the lowest common denominator and making the dialogue so kid-friendly that it just made me cringe listening to it. Not to mention it completely ruins the subtlety of the original film. It's a movie that thinks kids are stupid enough to watch anything. Number 4. Rugrats in Paris, the movie. I've long since grown out of the first Rugrats movie, but I can at least give it credit that it did its job. It appealed to fans of the show and upped the ante. Rugrats in Paris, on the other hand, just plain sucks. It's a movie so childish that the grown-ups sometimes talk more like children than the actual children. Of course, all the French characters are played by American actors and speak English 24/7. The animation is admittedly good, especially the moody shadows in some scenes, but it's just not an interesting adventure. And the climax is embarrassingly silly. Alright, now we're getting to the ones that I positively loathe with a fiery passion. And it just so happens that the top 3 worst movies I've ever seen all came out in 2009. Now there's an unfortunate coincidence. Number 3. The Ugly Truth. This movie is despicable. It's a shockingly sexist romantic comedy that's offensive to both men and women. All women are portrayed as shrewish control freaks for which sexual awakening is the cure, and all men are portrayed as base simpletons who only care about sex because they don't know any better. I know it's a comedy and it's meant to be exaggerated, but there is such a thing as going too far. I think the reason that annoys me so much in this case is because it's all to do with sex, and to me, that's a subject you don't fuck around with. Number 2, The Fourth Kind. That asshole again. This movie definitely elicited my most violent reaction watching a movie. It made me so angry that it took me a whole week to recover from the shock. It's bad enough that the acting is horrendous and the story is so vapid and slow-moving, but the movie boasts a stupid running gimmick of playing the supposed documentary footage alongside the dramatization, which is one of the most distracting things I've ever come across. It completely kills any investment in the drama, and it's all so obviously untrue in spite of its claim that it made my blood boil hotter than lava. And the number 1 absolute worst movie I've ever seen is Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. Good God! There's no way I'm sticking to my 100-word limit on this one. I could write a whole dissertation on how atrocious this movie is. Honestly, I'd rather watch any of the other movies I just listed than Transformers 2. I'd rather watch a marathon of all those other movies than sit through Transformers 2 again. I hate this movie so much, it's palpable. If they could somehow make power plants out of hatred, then my disdain for Transformers 2 could power the entire Northern Hemisphere for the next 500 years. Why? Because it's the embodiment of everything I hate about the film industry. Thoughtless greed and cynicism. It's a movie that has no respect whatsoever for its audience's intelligence, treating them like sheep who'll mindlessly flock to see anything with the Transformers name on it. It's insultingly stupid, and I mean way beyond stupid. It's long, it's vapid, it's manipulative, it's unfocused, it's terribly shot, it's terribly acted, it's terribly written, it's insufferably boring. Everything that defines a bad movie for me is on display here. And the fact that it had such a big budget makes it even worse. It cost $200 million. There's no excuse. No fucking excuse. Transformers 2 is the perfect example of my seething hatred for Michael Bay. Fuck him, and this movie in particular, straight to the 10th level of hell! Wow, I really ranted a lot on that last one. But it's no exaggeration. Transformers 2 really is the ultimate fuel for my rage. So now I'm going to go and take a big deep breath and maybe eat some chocolate because I was getting so angry there. Next week we'll get back to talking about stuff I like. My favorite TV shows, perhaps.